But the negative economic argument is basically that back in 1970, we spent 10% of our income on transportation. And between 1970 and the present time, we pretty much doubled the number of roadways in the US. And now what we've accomplished by that is we now spend 20% of our income on transportation. We've managed to tie ourselves to the least efficient, most costly system for getting ourselves around.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. I created this podcast and the School for Good Living to share what I've learned, and to keep exploring the question, what does it mean to live a good life, and how can we do it? Despite my privilege, I lived for decades in a pretty dark place, and I know that living is often a painful, difficult, and messy business. But I also know that it can be wonderful beyond imagination, and that it's a skill at which we can improve. That's why every episode is a conversation with an author who's an expert regarding spirituality, health, relationships, work, rest and play, or money. I also ask my guests about their creative habits, routines, and mindsets, and what they've done to get their books written, published, and read. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the School for Good Living. For all the things you do to improve the quality of your life, from your daily habits and routines, to the food you eat, the exercise you do, the sleep you get, all of that is fantastic. But how much do you think about where you live and the impact that it has on the quality of your life? My guest today, Jeff Speck, is a city planner and urban designer who advocates internationally for more walkable cities. He's created something called the general theory of walkability, something he lays out in his book, Walkable City, How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time. He shares how creating walkable cities can help us to be happier, healthier, have less impact on our environment, greater sense of community, more equity, and improve our lives financially as well, in the economics, personally and as a society. Jeff is someone who, part of what I love about Jeff's work is that he points out paradoxes that aren't necessarily evident, at least they weren't to me. Things like widening roads doesn't necessarily make them safer, because people just go faster and then they're deadlier. Or widening roads to alleviate congestion doesn't lead to less congestion, paradoxically it leads to more. Or the fact that, yes, cities do create more carbon emissions than rural areas, but not when you measure it on a per capita or a per person basis. So Jeff points out paradoxes, contradictions, goes beyond the surface of the way we live. Now you might be thinking, why does that matter to me? Well, you might not be a public official, you might not work in transit, you might not work in urban designs, or maybe you do. If I had learned some of the things that Jeff was sharing when I was in college, I might have taken my life and my career this way, because I hadn't thought a lot about the design of our cities, of our environments as having such an impact on all those things, but it might for you. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I hope you take away something that you find interesting. Maybe you'll move where you're living, or maybe you'll take a more active role in the community where you are to make your city more walkable. You can learn more about Jeff and his work at jeffspeck.com. You can also find him on Twitter. You can also find Jeff's TEDtalks, which have been viewed more than 4 million times. Jeff is a great communicator. He's funny. He's interesting. His ideas are insightful. I think you'll enjoy them. Although Jeff leads with walkability, he also touches on transit and bicycling. I hope you enjoy this conversation with my new friend and walking advocate, Jeff Speck. Jeff, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Thank you for having me, and I intend on living very well for the next 90 minutes.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that as well. Jeff, will you tell me, please, what's life about?
Well, I have this conversation with my children. I have a boy who's 12 and a boy who's 10, and the younger one is particularly curious about why he's alive. And he asked that question, not sadly, but he asked that question on occasion. I've decided that I'm an Epicurean. And an Epicurean, at least on the surface of it, is, or how people understand it, is someone who enjoys good things, good living, good wine and food, and a well-set table, and just living it up and partying and all that. But actually, if you look into it a little bit deeper, which I haven't done except for a tiny bit. what I've seen is that Epicureanism is about increasing the amount of pleasure in the world. And if you think about what that means, you inevitably get down to the goal of decreasing the amount of pain in the world. That's the most effective way to increase the amount of pleasure in the world, is to decrease the amount of pain in the world. So my philosophy about what life is about is to make it better for everyone else, the best that you can, ideally by making other people's lives better. That sounds a little bit pat now that I say it. But if you frame it within the concept of pleasure, I think you get a much broader understanding of what's possible. So when my kids ask me what's life about, I basically say, and I'm not a philosopher, and so I'm not the kind of person to ask this question, but you asked it. I usually say you should have as good a time as you can while you're alive. The long-term impacts will probably be minimal, but while you're here, you should have as good a time as you can have while giving as good a time to as many other people as you can as well, and perhaps giving them less of a bad time.
Right on. Well, thank you. No one has ever answered in quite that way. So
not surprised.
That's no surprise. Though your work is quite unique from most of the guests that I would say all the guests I've had on the show. And I'll tell you, as I read your book, Walkable City, I found myself thinking, I might have missed my calling. Like in college, I didn't even know this was the thing, urban design and so forth. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me ask this question, because you've espoused this philosophy about minimizing pain, helping to increase, the pleasure and maybe even the joy in the world, although you didn't use exactly that word. But each of us, I think, ultimately needs a vehicle or a way in which we take whatever it is we believe or we value and share it with the world. So what is your way of doing that?
So that's actually something I do think about a lot, because there are different ways to have different impacts. And if you don't mind my going off a little bit on this.
Please.
As a designer, it's a very important question to ask regarding the type of work that you take on. So my mentors were Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, who are a husband and wife whose firm DPZ created this movement called the New Urbanism, which was about rediscovering traditional ways of making places and reinvigorating, our older cities and building new places that function and feel like the old places that we love. And I worked with them for 10 years, and I was kind of in charge of the choices the firm was making regarding business decisions at one point. And I said to them, or I asked Liz, I said, if we did this, if we took on this staff and changed the firm in this way, we could do many more projects, expand our reach. And she said to me, Jeff, we've done 200 projects, and 198 of them have not had the impact of the other two. And her point was that actually, and these two projects happen to be places, you can look them up, called Seaside and called Kentlands. And if you look them up, you realize that, they were the trendsetters, and they were the ones that made the most change and had the most radical propositions at the time when they were built. And the larger lesson there is that you have to be very careful that you're not spinning your wheels doing the same thing over and over again. But also, if you choose your work very carefully, you can do very little and have a tremendous impact.
I think of Gutenberg, by the way, on that as an example.
Yeah, there you go. One really good idea.
One thing, and bam.
Yeah. So in the very narrow context of being a designer, I would say one makes change by doing projects that are unprecedented and also well publicized. But that kind of gets into the larger answer to the question, which is that my principal impact in my work has been because I'm able to write about it. So I have my own firm, and I do plans, and I think they're great plans, and I'm skilled at creating them. But the place where I've been able to make a real difference, because I'm one of many people, I'm one of 100. My firm is one of 100 that can give you a damn good plan for a site, or to revitalize a city center. But where I've been able to have the most impact is by writing about it. And actually, the first time I did that was with Andres and Liz. So when I heard Andres speak for the first time and give one of his classic lectures in 1989, my initial reaction was, wow, this is the best story I've ever heard. And secondly, this needs to be a book. And it took 11 years, but eventually we wrote together, with me doing the first draft, a book called Suburban Nation, which ended up having a very large impact in helping to spread the mission of the firm and of the new urbanism. But my voice, which is honestly just a written version of the way Andres talks, has proven, I think, to be a really good way to get this message out. And so I'm not thinking about it often enough, but I think the way that I can have the most impact in an ongoing way is to keep that communication line open. And both through the books, but then eventually I learned, and now currently through all the talk, all the speaking I do and the videos and that sort of thing. But when the history is written about the new urbanist movement, if it deserves it, I think, my role will be that of communicator. I think that puts additional pressure on me to be articulate with you this morning.
And witty and charming.
Yeah. Now the pressure is really on, but if at any point this begins to sound not humble, I think, what I really want to make clear is that I've had so few ideas of my own. Like I get credit for a lot of the ideas in the new urbanist movement. And I don't know if I've had an original design idea in my whole career. But what I've been able to do is collect everyone else's and share them in a way that people find interesting to listen to.
Yeah. I've found them interesting. I've watched 3 of your TED Talks. I read Walkable City. I've been on your website, and I've learned so much, things that I'd never even thought about. And part of what I love about the bit of your work that I've consumed is about how it starts to expand my awareness, where every one of us is born in a time and a place, and in some ways we're the product of, or maybe even the victim of, the circumstances in which we're born. And we don't think about things like, hey, what's a neighborhood, right? Like, why are there so many damn parking lots? Or why is the solution to congestion always making the roads wider? I mean, we just take it as a given that those are the solutions, right? And so you really helped. First of all, I found it really interesting, just as a curious learner. But I realized I might not be your typical reader. So one of the things I was curious about as I read is this book in particular. I know you've written multiple books, and Walkable City's actually not your most recent book, but that's one that maybe contains the essence of your ideas, the general theory of walkability. So my question is, who did you write this book for, or who do you write for, and what do you want your writing to do for them ultimately?
Well, that was the other kind of breakthrough, which is that not that many planning books or city planning books or urban design books are written for a general audience, and very few that have been successful. There are a few crossover books that might have been written for planning audiences that were just so well written that lots of people read them. For example, a Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander is a book that was really written for designers that so many people read, and not just designers. But my goal has always been, and I don't know why, maybe because I wasn't a popular child, but I want my books to be popular. And from the beginning, when I started learning about these concepts of design, and I want to get back to what it means to observe your environment and not ask questions, as you suggested. But from the beginning of hearing these ideas, it struck me that everyone needed to hear them, and that they were generally fascinating, and that there was a place for a book that talked about them. And in fact, when I heard Andres give his talk, which he used to call just Towns versus Sprawl, it struck me as exactly the way you described. Like, I had all these feelings that were kind of these inchoate, not enunciated feelings about why I loved certain places and hated other places. And I hadn't thought much about the forces and the techniques that had caused those places to come into being. And what this talk, Towns versus, I'm selling the wrong book, but what this talk, which became Suburban Nation, basically laid out was, wow, I mean, there are 2 different ways to design cities. There's one that we've used for millennia and it's always worked. And there's one that we've been using for 50 years and it's a failure. And we've made it illegal to do it the right way. And here's why we love one and hate the other. And here's how we can make it normal again. And that just struck me as something that everyone needed to hear. So being someone who was interested in influencing public opinion and gaining a large readership, I found a literary agent through a connection, and so much of our lives, as you've talked about, is about the fortune that we might have in our connections and just circumstances that we're in. And I had the ability to connect with a literary agent who found, an outline on that topic to be compelling, and we found a publisher, some would say the best publisher for R. Strauss. And that book went out and was quite successful. So then when 10 years later, I realized that I had another book to write that was more about cities and less about sprawl and suburbs, I went back to them, and I was lucky enough to get that contract. But I began with the goal that not that many design writers begin with, which is, I want everyone to read this book, particularly if you're in the academy. That's almost looked down on, right? People at Harvard are writing for people at Columbia and vice versa. And that never really appealed to me as a strategy. I should say, and you're kind to mention my more recent book, it's called Walkable City Rules. It is not meant for your audience, probably. I would love for it to have a large audience, but it's much more meant for people who are doing the work. So Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making Better Places, is 101 rules. Each one is 2 pages with a headline and a subtitle and a text and a picture or diagram and a rule at the end, like how wide to make your lanes when you're creating a street. That's super important if you're doing the work, and that's the stuff that everyone gets wrong. So I feel that everyone who's doing the work needs to read it. But you are correct that Walkable City is the book that was written to convert more generalists to this cause, and that still does very well as a general book that's sold for people who are curious about cities and urban design.
Yeah. Something you talk about that, first of all, I love to walk. I sometimes think,
So do I.
I've said to my wife when I'm 60, and as I go to say this in this moment, the confidence that I once felt is not quite there in this moment, but I said, when I'm 60, I'm going to walk across India.
Wow.
And I think from time to time about walking across the United States. I've organized 50-mile walks here in Utah for many years and so forth. So that's part of what intrigued me just about walkability. But then as I learned about sprawl, as I learned about how the automobile has shaped our landscape, or we've allowed it to, and so forth, and you talk about like sprawl is one of the worst things that we've ever done.
Yes, it's the worst thing we've ever invented, I would say.
Worst thing we've ever invented. Yeah. I thought that was a pretty bold claim, and the car is what's made that possible. And these 3 things that you talk about the economics, about the environment, right, and about health, as these 3 things. Will you just share a little bit about that? I mean, people listening, they might go like, why is sprawl such a bad thing? Right? But what is this and these 3 things about the environment, the health, and the economics?
So in Walkable City, there's the 10 Steps of Walkability, which talks about what we can do in our communities. But the first part of the book is why walkability. And there's 3 chapters. One's called Why Johnny Can't Walk, right? That's about health. Actually, I don't remember the names of the chapters, but they're focused on the 3 other professions that were talking from their own Bibles, ultimately about the same God that I was talking about, but much more effectively and convincingly. So for years, we had been arguing planner arguments and architect arguments and aesthetic arguments about why we needed to make our cities different, and getting some successful response, but nothing like the sort of response due to their compelling arguments that the economists were getting, the epidemiologists were getting, or the environmentalists were getting. So I made an effort to study all 3 of their arguments, and I'm very forthright about, citing my sources. For economics, it's largely a fellow at Brookings named Chris Lineberger, who for many years ran one of the largest real estate companies in the US. For health, it's a bunch of epidemiologists led by, his name is so normal, I always blank on it. For health, it was a bunch of epidemiologists, most notably led by Dick Jackson, who was, I think, Schwarzenegger's health guru when he was governor of California. And for the environment, it was a great book, actually, called Green Metropolis by David Owen, who's a New Yorker writer. But then supplementing that with lots of other sources. The principal economic argument, there's kind of a positive side and a negative side. I don't want to spend too much time on this because, of course, it's well laid out in my TED Talks and in my book. And I would direct your audience to my TED Talks, which in 15 minutes each really lay out the stuff that I'm trying to say. And one of my TED Talks, called The Walkable City, is all about the why. It's about what I'm about to say. And the other one, which I think is called 4 Steps to the Walkable City or something like that, is about how to do it in your community. But the negative economic argument is basically that we've, back in 1970, we spent 10% of our income on transportation. And between 1970 and the present time, we pretty much doubled the number of roadways in the US. And now what we've accomplished by that is we now spend 20% of our income on transportation. We've chosen to tie ourselves. You've got nothing to do with the auto industry, do you? Joking. We've managed to tie ourselves to the least efficient, most costly system for getting ourselves around. And so it's created this tremendous tax on our economy. And thank goodness we have a very wealthy economy, because we're spending so much of it on that choice, which is just so inefficient in terms of moving people. And if you're poor, you're actually, as so defined by the federal government, you're spending as much or more on transportation than you are actually on housing. So it's become this incredible burden on our pocketbooks. But then there are much more compelling economic arguments to be made about the value of cities and the value of walkable cities. And the amazing data, thanks now to WalkScore, which is this website you can go to and rank the walkability with some accuracy, not great accuracy, but enough accuracy. You can rank the walkability of your community. It's very easy to demonstrate that people value walkable places tremendously more than drivable places. And that, the same square footage in leafy country club drivable suburbia is worth a quarter of what it is in downtown where you can live without the expense of a car. So there's tremendous demand for these places. And then there's the even more fundamental argument that, why do cities exist? They exist for an economic reason, which is that we're more productive when we're close together in proximity with each other, that the denser cities generate more patents per capita, that the more you drive, actually, the less wealthy your state is. There's all these really interesting data points, but it's very clear from people who study cities and the way that biologists study bodies that a more dense walkable place is just a much better engine for wealth. The health arguments are in some ways the most obvious. We've pretty much made walking useless in this country. And there was a book that came out in 2004 called Urban Sprawl and Public Health by these 3 doctors, including Dick Jackson and Howard Frumpkin, and then a planner actually named Frank, not a doctor, but they all, I believe it's Michael Frank. But they basically laid out a tremendous amount of, I think what was most important is that they're doctors, they're public health experts, and they discovered that probably the greatest threat to our health is the way that we've organized our communities.
Yeah, and that was such a huge insight to me, to say that increasingly, because you write in your book, it's becoming clear that the American healthcare crisis is largely an urban design crisis.
Yeah.
And I love these things that are not necessarily obvious, but when you really start looking at numbers and the reality of what's going on in our country, that there's a lot of evidence for this.
Yeah, and diet matters, but all we talk about is diet. And it's half the picture. It's calories in and calories out. And we've engineered out of existence the useful walk. And because we no longer have a reason to walk, we're told we should walk for exercise. Well, a certain percentage of the population, and it's a minority, will sign up for a certain number of minutes of exercise every day, right? But for most of us, if we don't have that daily activity in a useful way, we're not going to do it. If you switch from driving to taking transit, you will lose 6 pounds within the first month. I mean, there's all these studies, and the most interesting one came out after the book, and I'm going to paraphrase, I don't remember it exactly, but they had the best blind study you can possibly have in China, where it's randomly assigned who is given the right to purchase a car and who isn't. And they studied the folks who were given the ability to purchase a car and those who weren't. And for those who were over 50, the people who got cars were 20 pounds overweight within a couple of years, and those who didn't get cars weren't. So there you go.
And this right now has been focused on the physical health, right? But we know there's significant mental and emotional health consequences as well.
Yeah.
And whether
we
it's
don't
just
talk enough about, and I don't talk enough in the book about the incredible loss of life due to air pollution that happens around major roadways.
Yeah.
And that's been more and more discovered lately. But someone, I forget the state, but it was just in the news a week ago that, it was actually in the UK, that someone's death was finally attributed to air pollution from the roadway near their house. And we don't talk about that enough. And then just to finish, Brilliant, with the three things, the environmental argument is a little bit counterintuitive, because the environmentalist movement in the US and around the world, really, until maybe the 90s, was very much an anti-city movement. And if you look at the roots of it in the US and the Sierra Club and everything else, it's always been an anti-city, pro-suburbs. If you love nature, go move out into nature and be a part of it. And that certainly makes some sense. But, and I should say that message only became stronger when we started mapping carbon, because people were mapping carbon per square mile. And if you look at a carbon output per square mile map of the US, the cities are red hot and the suburbs are cooler and the countryside is, cold. But then another really important economist said, a guy named Fred Bernstein at the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, he said, hey, we're measuring this the wrong way. We should be looking at carbon output per household or per person, not per square mile. And when you map a carbon output per household map, it's exactly the opposite. The cities are dead cold and the suburbs are quite warm, and the ex-urban areas where everyone's driving all the time are bright red. And the message there that now more and more environmentalists have told us, as highlighted in this book, Green Metropolis by David Owen, if you love nature, the best thing you can do is live far away from it, in the densest, most, transit-served, walkable, bikeable city that you can find, because that's how you are going to limit your carbon output. So there's more to say on that topic, but essentially there's kind of a global agreement now that cities are the solution to the climate crisis. And of course, we define urban very loosely in the US. And I guess more than half of us now live in urban areas, but I would still say that 90% of those urban areas are suburban areas where people are still driving a ton. And it's really the quite limited number of Americans who live in our denser, either small and walkable or larger and transit-served communities that are having the lightest carbon footprint. So someone in New York City burns half the gas of someone in Houston. And remarkably, someone in Toronto is burning half as much gas as they are because of the better transit in Toronto. And someone in Europe, in a European city, is half as much again. And someone in Hong Kong is half as much again. And the data I put in Walkable City is that if 10 Hong Kongers were to move to New York City, our most walkable place, if 10 Hong Kongers were to move to New York City and try to keep their carbon footprint where it was before they moved, then 9 of them would have to stay home all day.
That whole thing about flipping the carbon map just by measuring per person, again, is the kind of thing that when you see, you're like, oh, of course, why didn't we start out doing that? But as research gets reported, it's not always what it appears initially. So that's again a perfect example of what I love about your writing, is bringing those things to our awareness. But in some ways, I suspect that this is kind of preaching to the choir. I would think. I mean, hopefully, you're educating and converting people from a way of living they might have had. But even in your work where you talk about, look, many millennials will just choose a city where they want to live for its livability, and largely because it's walkable, it has transit, it's bike friendly, this kind of thing. And then they'll find a job. And I know every community, or many communities, they want that vibe. But of course, it's not the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, and I should say in the 10 years since the book's come out, the millennials have started to make different choices. And I don't think, I won't say the book was wrong, but I will say that it didn't pay enough attention to some of the other deeper underlying issues around the choices we make. And now that the millennials are having kids, they are essentially being forced by the metropolises that they live in to move to the suburbs where they perceive the schools are better. And, why are people making choices about where they live? Once you're a parent, it's all about your kids. And that means mostly the schools. And we have this unfortunate condition in the US, which is by no means inevitable, but it's the way that we do it, that your school is funded by, your municipality, typically. Maybe it's your county, but something close at hand. And as such, the quality of your school is going to be a function of the wealth of your municipality. It's not like other countries where the schools are fairly equal for everyone. So, inner city schools have been allowed to get worse and worse. And, it feels ungenerous to make the choice to abandon your own neighborhood school if you're living in a older city center. But parents will desperately make the choice that they feel is best for their children. And the circumstances then have caused a bunch of millennials now to move to suburbs they don't want to be in, just so their kids can have that better school.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, as you kind of alluded to, some of the questions I might have asked you, people can watch your TED Talks, they can read your books, they can listen to your interviews or read your other blogs and articles. You're very prolific, and I suggest they do, especially if they're in public office or interested in community service or engineering, urban design, these kinds of things. People, I suspect many of the people who are in those latter categories have found your work, at least I hope they have. But let me turn the conversation now to a moment. I'll say this too, in the design of this conversation today. So what we've got left is something called the Enlightening Lightning Round. So a series of about 9 questions on a variety of topics. So that takes 20-ish minutes. Writing and creativity, that could take 30 minutes. So if we had another 10 to 15 minutes to talk about anything that you are curious about now, anything you're currently researching, anything you've changed your mind about, anything else you want to talk about, what would it be?
Well, I think we were headed in a certain direction, which is to try to understand why America is this way, and also what we can do about it. You described quite naturally, and I think correctly, that most people want to live in walkable environments, and yet so few of us do, right? And even though there's this American myth, or I should say American dream, that's real for many of the house on its own lot in a neighborhood, most people end up with a house on a lot in a subdivision with nothing but other houses around it and the inability to walk to anything. And when polled by the National Association of Realtors, a considerable majority of Americans will tell you they want to live in a house from which they can walk to school, work, jobs, certainly the corner store, to get a can of cat food. And that's unavailable. There's a fewer number of Americans who really want to live in a dense inner city. But frankly, if our suburbs were better organized, that wouldn't be important, right? The way our early suburbs grew, and I grew up in one of these suburbs that were the norm before 1950, each community had its own center. You could walk to the center. That center had a train stop or a significant bus stop that would take you into the inner city where the jobs were concentrated. And that was a very efficient, environmentally sustainable, healthy way to live. What happened was not the advent of the automobile, but because every nation got automobiles, but the decision to reorient the design of our nation around the presumption that everyone would be driving one. That's what happened. And that's resulted in not only, the suburbanization of the country, but then the establishment both of a whole bunch of laws that made it necessary and impossible to do otherwise, and the establishment of a whole bunch of business models. The real estate developer who only makes shopping malls, the banker who only lends out loans for single family homes that have to be grouped into tranches for a secondary market and then resold, so that you can't have an anomalous house with a, that happens to have a store at the bottom of it, right? So all these businesses reorganize themselves. And then, of course, the ever increasing demands of traffic, because when you design the society to be broken into little pieces and then reconnected only with the car, your streets have to get wider and wider and wider. And the experience of your typical suburban inhabitant is that the problem is traffic And the solution to traffic is more roads, which of course doesn't work because because of induced demand, they immediately become congested as they were before, or within 4 years, every new lane mile is just as congested as, on average, is just as congested as what you started with before you widened your road or added that road. It's kind of a self-reinforcing mechanism that's been very hard to turn around. So we have an American landscape that doesn't meet American needs, that doesn't meet American wants, that one hopes perhaps a new DOT head who's from a community that has benefited from the work of my colleagues and other new urbanists, making them more bikeable, more transit-friendly, more walkable, will reinforce with the upcoming funding from there, which only has a limited impact. But the biggest impediment to making change quickly probably has been local zoning laws. And local zoning laws have been shaped around, and by the way, there's an incredibly important book called The Color of Law. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's one of the best-selling planning books, and rightly so has been for the few years since it became known. And it came out maybe 4 years ago. I believe it's by Richard Rothstein. It's called The Color of Law. And it shows how zoning in the US grew out of, I should say, land, use-based zoning, which is what we have, right? Land use-based zoning in the US, as it pertains to residential communities, pretty much grew out of and was the maturation of race-based zoning. And that the single-family zoning category was created, and in many places explicitly so, as a way to sidestep and have the same outcome as the race-based zoning laws that were becoming illegal due to the civil rights movement.
I just want to jump in here for a moment and say I had never heard that, but it doesn't surprise me, as I have watched other things like the documentary The 13th about how inequality has been systematized, and it's, in some ways it's just morphed to become less visible or more, it's just this cultural incarnation's acceptable form.
Yeah.
That's really remarkable.
So this is not my focus, although I've become quite interested in it, but there's certainly a very important conversation that needs to be had about what that means in terms of racial justice, white supremacy, and reparations, in fact, because the stated purpose of the book is to demonstrate that the government had a role in the creation of the landscape that has essentially disenfranchised people of color, right?
Oh, yeah. Like I've heard about this in Detroit primarily, like as a great example.
If you can't prove that the federal government had that role, then you can't demonstrate the need for reparations or some other legal remedy. However, where it is relevant to my work in particular is just to acknowledge that we have zoning regimes in most of our cities that are quite strange, quite unnatural, and by no means inevitable. And that, in fact, by beginning to undermine in ways that would not hurt the quality of communities in any way, that would benefit the quality of communities, by beginning to undermine the single-family zoning laws that cover the majority of zoned land in the United States, we can have a profound impact on the quality of life of these communities. We have a tremendous housing crisis in most places in this country, and it's a function of the fact that we make it so hard to build any form of density on most of our land. Even Trump has talked about this when he fought back and said, I've preserved your leafy single-family suburbs. He didn't really know what he was talking about, but the changes that some communities are enacting, that we'll see if there's any federal leadership on this, but the changes that many communities are enacting is simply to say, hey, you can put a duplex on this property. Or, if you want to have an apartment house by the transit stop, you should be allowed to do that. In many of the communities that I work in, it's a simple switch to say you can build a granny flat in your backyard, right? You can put an apartment above your garage. This is illegal in so many places. And when enabling legislation like they've done in Los Angeles makes it possible, thousands of people do it. And of course, the great shock, not a shock to us, is that when you allow that, the neighborhood values go up, because all of a sudden your lot is worth a lot that can hold two homes and not just one. by allowing people to do more on their properties, you actually, tremendously increase the value of those properties. So it's an upzoning that benefits everyone. And someone, this is just a plain old tweet that wasn't that groundbreaking, but it just caught my eye and I keep thinking about it. And it describes the neighborhood I live in. I just read it a couple of weeks ago. This woman tweeted, I think those people who are fighting the addition of multifamily housing to their neighborhoods would really benefit from experiencing what it's like to have people out on your sidewalks on occasion near where you live. And what a wonderful thing that is. And I live on Beacon Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a very urban suburb that is essentially surrounded by Boston, but it's its own town called Brookline. The train is going by in the window as I speak. And I'm in an apartment in a whole bunch of they're not triple deckers, but 3-story apartment houses that are on this side of the street. Across the street, there's a couple 10-story buildings. One block behind me, it's all 2 to 3-story houses, many of which are multifamily. But this is one of the most valuable neighborhoods in America. I'm fortunate that I can afford to live here. And we know our neighbors, and the sidewalks are always full of people, and it's a delight, as opposed to these typical suburban subdivisions where you don't see a soul all day long and it's just garage doors facing the sidewalk, if you have a sidewalk.
Well, and I know we could go in a totally other direction, impelled by this course, of inquiry about, I think, and I go back to this about the emotional or the mental aspects of this, where we segment ourselves, separate ourselves. We don't get the motion, we're not moving. We don't get the health benefits from that. And just what that does for or loneliness, and these kinds of things, we're not even seeing, let alone interacting with other people. And we've seen from agriculture, anytime you monocrop, anytime you take a piece of the earth and you make it just one thing and you lose the diversity and the variety and all of this, it's like it dies. Ultimately, the nutrients and the life diminish.
Yeah, well, we use that analogy a lot. I mean, monocultures are not healthy. And, healthy cities have a little bit of everything. Or a lot of some things and a little bit of others, but the active choice was made, and it's remarkable, from the 1939 World's Fair, Futurama, right? That was on Long Island, as featured in Men in Black, right? That's where they go to launch the spaceship. And there was this GM-sponsored exhibit, The City of the Future, Futurama. Norman Bell Geddes, one of the leading planners of the time, wrote the text for the promotional film. And I have the exact quote in Walkable City Rules, and I'll get it wrong, but it's just so head scratching. He says in this movie voiceover, for the greater convenience of the population, places of work and living and shopping have all been separated from each other. And I'm like, what the hell are you thinking? Like, where's the logic? How could you have even uttered those words without considering what it meant? How can it possibly be more convenient to segregate the different aspects of your life into different places that you have to commute between by any vehicle? Although they were celebrating the automobile, but how does that make sense? And I wish, I could speak to his ghost and find out where he was from there. Le Corbusier, the famous French architect, planner, and great visionary of the modernist movement, the most important modernist that lived, he was much more explicit. And he said in a quote that we have in Suburban Nation, how we will separate places of work from places of living. All of this will necessitate engines, tires, gears, and roadways creating work for all, right? So there's a deeper conversation saying we're going to build a new economy around creating this transportation system that's new, which is kind of what we did they didn't do it in Europe, but we did it here.
Yep. Yeah, no doubt about it. So before we wrap, here's what I'm proposing is, I know before we started recording, you had some questions or maybe suggestions for me. And I definitely want to get to that, and we can go there if you want. Otherwise, what I propose is that we leave that to the end, move efficiently through these next two sections.
If you don't mind, let me complete a couple thoughts.
Yeah, please.
I wanted to say that the things that communities are doing now to make themselves better, more sustainable, to impact climate and people's quality of life are essentially the low-hanging fruit, eliminating single-family zoning, which simply means allowing multifamily to arrive slowly, as it will, when you put it in these neighborhoods. Secondly, eliminating on-site parking requirements, because developers, be they large or small, know what parking they need, and they don't need the city artificially mandating people bringing more cars into their communities, which end up just gumming up the streets, actually, and don't benefit anyone if you ask for more than people will bring on their own. Those two things would have a super profound impact. And then what a number of cities are already doing, including Massachusetts, just passed a law in its budget yesterday to do this, which is to actually require upzoning around transit stations. So if you have a significant transit station, be it train or bus in your community or many of them, the areas immediately surrounding those stops should be allowed to have considerably more housing. Those are changes that are happening in a lot of communities and could have a dramatic change if picked up at the national level. Then the second question is, what can private individuals do? And I think that I'm particularly interested in talking to someone who has access to resources to say, what are some of the most forward things that are happening? Robert Davis, back in 1979, went to my mentors, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and said, I want to make a new town. And I want it to be like the towns I grew up in and loved. And they developed Seaside, which has all sorts of flaws in terms of being a model because it's a resort and people loved it so much that it's become incredibly expensive and all the other things that happen to places that people love.
Is this Seaside in Oregon?
No, this is called Seaside in the Florida Panhandle. It's in Panama City, Florida. But it's now on the Rand McNally map. Even though it is not a municipality, it's on the Rand McNally map because people love it so much. It's called Seaside. It's near Panama City. And it's a new town that became a poster child for this new movement and was so important in allowing people to realize what was possible. And, the question is, what is the next community that will have as equally a profound impact? Seaside and its progeny, but it really started with Seaside, changed the practice of planning in this country in a profound way. One project. So the question is, what is the next project? I should say that there's one that's very important that I'm not involved in, but super interested in, that's called Cul-de-sac, hilarious name, and it's being developed in Tempe, designed by some friends of mine at a firm called Opticos. It's a car-free community. And they've done the right thing in publicizing it extremely well, high profile, great PR. And so they have a regional or even a national audience of people who want to live in the way that some folks do, in the Netherlands and other places, who want to live with the cars at the periphery. So in fact, you can be there and have a car, but many people will choose not to. And the cars are parked at the perimeter. And it's an entirely pedestrian. When it's done, it'll be an entirely pedestrian community. I'm very upset that I was not asked to design this. And I'm joking, but this thing happened without me. Oh my God. And I'm the walkability guy. I think that there's a market nationally for these to sprout up in every major metropolis. And if I had resources right now beyond my current ones, I would be creating a national model, going from city to city and making walkable new neighborhoods. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity. Now, I should say that's my advice for someone who wants to invest in making a real difference. Separate from that, at the government level, because a lot of the people that I deal with are mayors or other city officials or foundations within city centers. Most of the work that I do in my firm is not creating new places, although I do plenty of that, but trying to improve existing downtowns. And I've done what I call walkability studies now for 15 different cities, and some of them have been profoundly reshaped around those plans. I think every major city in the US needs a walkability study, which, to explain it in 60 seconds or less, basically we redesign every single street in the downtown using only paint, right? Understanding that we're not going to spend the money on moving any curbs, except with rare exception. Using only paint, we redesign every street in the downtown to have no more lanes than it needs, no wider lanes than it needs, bike lanes wherever they can be in the right place. Of course, ample pedestrian facilities. And for a really limited investment, a city can profoundly change the walkability of its downtown. And that's something that I'm looking forward to promulgating around the US in the next decade or so. But these studies, where I've done them in places like Cedar Rapids and Oklahoma City, have led to new, urban environments that have been key factors. Certainly not the only factor, but key factors in bringing those downtowns back. And so we need to see more of that happening as well.
The thing I love about that is it's so comprehensible, right? Like you talk about, traffic engineers will always say, we need a traffic study. We need a traffic study. It's like the hammer, the only tool they have, right? But until now, as I understand it, basically no one's been talking about walkability studies. And now, not only is it available, but we know that the result of a successfully executed plan, that probably started with a walkability study, is exactly what we've talked about improved health, improved economics, and a better environment.
Yeah, no, and by the way, since I wrote Walkable City and moved on to Walkable City rules, I added 2 more categories to that list of 3, which are community and equity. I had previously grouped community kind of under health, right, and social health, but there's so much evidence that walkable places have healthier culture and more socializing, and as you suggested, surrounding mental health, more togetherness, right? More neighborliness. Secondarily, it can be amply demonstrated how the automobile has been a vehicle, pun intended, for increased segregation, increased class-based impacts, and race-based impacts. If you look at who's dying as pedestrians, and by the way, that's gone up 50% in the last 10 years, the number of people killed by cars as pedestrians, mostly due to SUVs, by the way. If you look at who's dying, it's incredibly inequitous, let's just say, inequitable, whatever the word is. And of course, who makes use of transit and who are the people that benefit when you invest in walkable solutions. There are, any effort to make our country more equitable is going to focus more on solutions that don't require driving.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I keep thinking, and you've probably thought on this, but about how, whatever it is, Tree City, USA, which you write about how that's kind of crap. Anyway, but there's also
a small start.
Yeah, it's a start. But then there's also, the B Corp certification. So there's these labels that certain organizations endow, certain buildings or other organizations with. Have you given thought to establishing like a walkable city USA, like a label or something for certain communities?
Just not into that, but that's an interesting idea. There's a very excellent organization called America Walks that I think would be the ones to do that. And Mike McGinn, the former mayor of Portland, Oregon, is running that organization, and he's great. And that would be the group to do that. And next time I speak to him, I'll bring that up.
What a fun idea. Yeah, I love that. And it seems like it's a pretty easy checklist, like a walkability study. Anyway, that's fun. Okay.
Well, if you need to do a walkability study to qualify, I'd be all for it.
That's what I'm talking about. That's how these things often work, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So are you good to jump into the Enlightening lightning round?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So again, this is a series of brief questions. You're welcome to answer as long as you want. My aim, for the most part, is to ask the question and just stand aside.
But you want maybe a 1-sentence answer, or
Okay.
you want a paragraph answer?
Whatever feels right to you. A lot of them are.
Well, I like to answer each question for 10 minutes, so it won't be a lightning round.
Okay. It might be a 1-question lightning round. All right, here we go. Question 1. Please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates. Life is like a...
Infinite possibility.
All right. Question 2. Here I'm borrowing Peter Thiel's famous question. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
Oh, my. Well, I'm going to get very specific to my profession, but very few people understand that we can have the cities we want and the city streets that we want, and we can decide how much traffic we want to have.
Okay. Question number 3. If you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan on it, or a phrase or a saying or a quote or a quip, What would the shirt say?
This is hard. Can we walk there?
I love it.
I'm often saying that to my wife or children.
What was it that Stephen Wright said? Everywhere is walking distance if you've got the time.
Oh, that's good. He also said, I spilled spot remover on my dog. Now he's gone. By the way, I saw Stephen Wright in a club when he was an unknown in Boston. And we went up to him afterwards and said, you're going to be famous. And he mumbled something.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Question number 4. What book, other than your own, have you gifted or recommended most often?
So I'm amazed I haven't said it yet in this interview, but the best planning book of all time that you're probably aware of is The Life and Death of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. And that is the book that began the reformation of the planning profession off of its mistaken path in the early 60s.
All right. Thank you for that. Number 5. So you have traveled a lot. What's something you do when you travel? You know, back in the good old days where we still did that kind of thing? So what's something you do when you travel or something you take with you to make your travel less painful or more enjoyable?
Well, one thing I really enjoy is packing super, super light. I found it's incredibly liberating to do that. I also shower the night before, and every time I travel, I see how fast I can get from being asleep to at the gate. That's a fun thing to do.
Wow.
Additionally, because this is really up my alley and something that I am a real lover of, I like to, when I go to a city, I will have my map, or my phone map or whatever, but I will just absolutely get lost and then try to find my way back with or without the map, using the map if I need to. But the main advice I would give to your listeners, which I'm surprised more people don't do, which I guess you could call travel like a city planner, is before I go to any city for any reason, I get on the Google Maps. And of course, it depends on the city, but let's say it's a European city, I find the best part of that city, which is not hard to do. I find that the medieval part of the city, the part that has the cranky streets, and of course, different parts of the world, there's different ways to identify it. But it's not that hard with a little bit of research to end up in the part of the city that is the most delightful, most walkable. And you'd be amazed to the degree that travel guides and other sources will not send you there. And how many times have you or someone ended up in a hotel that's just not in the part of town that you want to be in? And it is so easy and rewarding to spend some time on Google Maps, find that location, and then of course, when you do your hotel or Airbnb search or whatever you're doing, to limit yourself to that location.
That's awesome. That's fun. Okay. Question number 6. What's something you've started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
How about what I need to stop doing?
We'll count that.
I'm addicted to Twitter, and I think that's had a real negative impact on me. So one of my New Year's resolutions was to not look at it before bed, not to look at it when I wake up, not to look at it until noon. That's a very small thing, but I think that to get very contemporary and in the moment and, what's having an impact on Americans now that's most relevant. I do think that our attention spans are getting shorter and our ability to focus is getting weaker. And, now a one-page article seems long to me, and that's just really bad. So I'm making a real effort to limit my social media exposure. That's kind of a common thing that people talk about, but I have to say, I think it's one of the most important things we can do.
Yeah. Number 7. What's one thing you wish every American knew?
Well, I'm playing to type, brilliant, but I would say that most Americans don't know that they would have a higher quality of life and a happier, healthier, wealthier life if they were to move to a place where they didn't need to drive everywhere, period. And that actually, you don't need a big yard or a yard at all if you live in a properly designed community, that if you're not paying for that car or that second or that third car, you can have a much better apartment or home, or that your quality of life in an urban apartment where you don't need to have a car, but everything is at easy reach, is much higher than having your own big chunk of property somewhere where you actually have no access to anything without using the car as your prosthetic device.
Yeah. Question number 8. What's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about making relationships work?
There's a whole bunch of cliches that I could use that you've heard before, but I would say that I think managed to limit my compulsion to always be right to my professional life.
Wow. That sounds like a wise man. What was that about? Oh, that was something I heard about. Anyway, I'll pass. Okay, last one here. Aside from compound interest, what's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about money? Or what's something you're always sure to do with it or you never do with it?
I'm not sure if it's useful. I think one interesting thing I've learned about money is that once you have more of it, you never want to have less of it. And so I would say, try to delay the moment in your life when you get more of it. I know a lot of people, all they need is more of it, right? A lot of people want more of it. A lot of people actually need more of it. But your lifestyle adjusts to the amount of money that you have. And you can be happy, within certain limits, you can be happy, self-sufficient and self-sustaining at a relatively low income, a relatively moderate income, or quite a high income. But at every point, you feel like anything lower is unacceptable. And you can be much more creative on a lower income. Higher income and your expectation of maintaining it really ties your hands, right? So at the point in your life where you're charting your path, where you're not sure yet what you're going to be doing, and you want to have the greatest access to the greatest opportunities, it's actually good to not be thinking about how much you're earning or to be locked into a certain expectation. Just to give an example, and I'm fine with this, and no one's asking me, but like I couldn't join the Biden administration now because it would tremendously cut my income. So I'm not willing to do that. I wish I was. So it's a bit of a handcuffs to the fact that just as animals, we, the animal side of our brain is makes it very hard for us to accept less than we've grown accustomed to, and so there's a danger in growing accustomed to too much. I had another piece of advice. Oh yeah, and of course, the other thing about money that most people should know, but not everyone does, is that what matters isn't beyond a certain threshold. What matters isn't how much you have; it's the ratio of how much you have to how much you spend.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think what people who earn less might not know is that people who earn more than them probably have as much economic anxiety, past a certain threshold where you're struggling to live. People who earn, twice as much often have just as much economic anxiety as people who earn half as much, because they've, again, adjusted their outflow and somehow naturalized it and said, this is inevitable. And, you can make the choice. And I love those guys like Mr. Money Mustache and the other people who specialize in spending as little money as possible and just really enjoying the bargains, that you can actually earn more and not change your lifestyle and be perfectly happy. So it's really a matter of expectations. And, I was brought up in a family which money was just never really much discussed, and we were comfortable, but we weren't rich, we weren't poor. And I try not to think about it too much, but even I have found it easy to get trapped into this feeling, more money good, less money bad. And what really matters is the ratio of income to output.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's something I think many people end up learning only through experience. But as we know, the wise learn from the experience of others. So, no, thank you for that. Okay, so I do have just a few more questions about writing and creativity. Okay, so the last part of the interview here, just a few questions about writing and creativity. I understand that you wrote much or maybe all of Walkable City in Italy.
At least the first half.
The first half. So I know it's hard enough to write a book when we're at home with all of the comforts and conveniences and maybe in familiar and routine places. So maybe the question we can start with here is, how did you organize your life and your time to be productive in a foreign country and get this book, at least the first half of this book, written?
I find writing really hard. I guess I enjoy it. People ask me, do you enjoy writing? And I say, I enjoy having written. Like, I'm really proud of writing. And unlike some tortured artists, maybe this is just evidence that I'm not that good. I really enjoy reading my own writing. And I enjoy, the sense of accomplishment that comes from finishing something, or even finishing a page, right? But the actual act of writing is very hard for me. I think that one of the greatest resources that we have that is least recognized and most important is focus and concentration. There's a great book about this. I think it's called The World Behind Your Head that I read recently. And it said things like, what are people actually paying for when they join the airport lounge? What they're paying for is silence or, peace and the ability to kind of be alone with your own thoughts. But it is very hard for me to muster up the concentration to spend hours writing. And so the environment is super important to me. I find that getting out of my normal environment is extremely useful. I find that reading fiction while I write nonfiction is really useful. Like, I'll read a ton of nonfiction because I have to build up the base of material for a book. But then when I start writing the book, I'm done with that. And when I'm not working and I am reading, I will limit myself to fiction, because fiction is about the beauty of the writing. And good nonfiction is informed by to a degree, you don't want to be Faulkner out there, but to a degree, good nonfiction writing can be tremendously improved by having the rhythms and the analogies and what's the word I want? Kind of the poetry of good nonfiction writing influencing it. And I think this is probably a bit of a lie, but I do tell people that I prefer to be in a place where English isn't spoken. It might be a lie that it helps me. It's not a lie that it's true. Like, I do speak Italian, okay, enough to function in that society, but not having to speak as much English while I'm writing in English, I find somehow cleanses the palate a little bit. And also, I think, like music, foreign languages make the brain more flexible in the way that it functions. Going to Italy was a function of a number of things. Certainly to be inspired to write about cities. Being in Rome and other places like it is a great thing. I also was fortunate enough to get either fellowships or, nice places to stay at various academies, like the American Academy in Rome, that is just a place where people go to get creative work done. That is an incredible boon. If you want to support a great organization with an incredible history, the American Academy in Rome is a wonderful thing. So it was a function of that as well. But yeah, I mean, it's particularly hard when you have a family to focus. And I should say that in some ways, the circumstance around writing Walkable City was less than ideal. It was harder on my wife than it was for me. But we had two quite small children, and we were in various apartments in Rome and Genoa. And she basically had to take the kids out of the house every day just so I could write. So we made a deal that I would write from breakfast until a late lunch, and then I was done. So another thing to say about writing is, if you can write for more than 4 or 5 hours a day, you're superhuman, because it's hard to sustain. I know some writers write all day long, but I don't see how they do that. So I'll write for half the day and then take the rest of the day off, or do something else that's completely different, like draw.
Who's been influential in your development as a writer, either directly as a teacher, maybe somebody even from grade school, junior high, high school, college, or maybe somebody that you never met, but they've inspired and influenced you through their writing or some other way?
So Jane Jacobs, who I mentioned, who wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, was principally a writer. She wasn't a trained planner. She wasn't a trained architect. She was a housewife who was super smart and moderately well-educated, but she had such an authoritative voice. And for someone at a time when, women weren't considered as much authorities as they should have been, and where she didn't have the credentials, for her in the early 60s, late 50s even, to be writing about cities with absolute confidence was really wonderful to read. And just the trenchant quality of some of her prose is really inspiring. I mentioned earlier, and it's pretty true, that the funny story around Suburbanation is that Andres Duani would give these talks that if you were to listen to them and watch them, you felt that you could just transcribe them and they'd be a book. What wasn't obvious at that moment when I thought that was that, in fact, so much of what he was doing was visual with his images and charisma, of which he has so much. And actually, when I wrote down the words he was saying, it was barely good English, let alone good writing. So the attempt to create a writing voice that was the equivalent of his speaking voice is kind of what created my voice on the page. And so I'm tremendously indebted to him. And I mean, he would tell you he couldn't have written it that way, but he created such a effect with his words and personality and images that trying to turn that into prose was the formulation of my voice.
Wow. When you're writing, how aware are you, or what's your sense of connection with a reader in the act of writing? And do you imagine a specific person or some kind of a composite reader or something else? What's that like for you?
That's a really great question. I never think of any specific reader at all. I write to entertain myself, if I can say that. And my goal is to put the words on the page in a way that I find compelling. And I should say that I don't think I'm an unusual person. Like I think that my tastes, sensibilities, and just way of thinking are not that different from your typical reader. So in satisfying my own needs, I'm hopefully satisfying others' needs. My ideal reader is pretty much someone who reads the New Yorker magazine, if I can say that. Although I don't put umlauts over my repeated O's as they do, or put 2 S's in the word focusing. Otherwise, our style guide is the same. But the thing that people, I think, maybe don't talk about enough is tempo and rhythm in writing. And there's clearly sentences that are, you can have 2 sentences that say the same thing, and one of them is a joy to read and the other one isn't, just because of the tempo, just because of the number of beats in that sentence. When you're creating a list of things with commas between them, often 4 is the right number or 2 is the right number, and you don't know it till you read it and hear it. And so much of my writing, I would say 90% of my writing, is reading the sentences I've just written before the sentence I'm about to write in order to create the connection that feels proper, both conceptually but also rhythmically.
Interesting. And when you say reading, do you mean reading aloud or just reading silently to yourself?
In a clinch, I'll even read it out loud, but normally just silently. I should say I've had the great pleasure of, and I had to earn it by interviewing, I should say by auditioning, but I had the pleasure of doing my 2 last books as audiobooks and being the reader.
Wow. And
that was a really great experience also. I was a DJ in college, so I'm comfortable at the mic, but you learn quickly that reading and writing are different skills.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Well, and I had someone on the show, I believe it was Donald Robertson, who wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, told me that he actually paid someone to come read him his manuscript. So he would just sit there. He teaches about Stoicism, so there's a part of this perhaps that's really appropriate. But he would just sit there and listen and occasionally interject and correct things that he thought didn't have that kind of tempo and rhythm.
That's a really conscientious way to do it, because it's just another step that we could take as writers that I didn't take, and I probably don't want to spend the time on. But honestly, a good writer will really want to know how other people pace what they say. I should also say that I've had great editors.
Yeah, that helped. Readers probably don't have any idea the difference that an editor really can make for their experience and understanding.
Yeah, if you've never had a great editor, it's like better than sex. When I was working on Suburbanation, everything I wrote, Andres edited and Liz edited, and then Ethan Nazowski, he's since moved on, but Ethan Nazowski was the editor for our Strauss. And every edit that Andres and Liz made frustrated me because they were changing what I wanted to say in some way. And of course, I was trying to lay out their ideas, so they were right. And it was a job that I had to do to interpret what they changed. Every change that Ethan made, I was like, yes, yes, yes. It was so beautiful to see my writing get even better. I said to him once, I said, Ethan, you're an amazing writer. He goes, no, I'm just an amazing editor.
Yeah, it's definitely a skill. No, quite like really special skill. So writing a book can be very daunting, challenging on a lot of different levels. What I wonder is if you have, now that you've written a number of books, if you have arrived at a process, something that you could fairly briefly articulate. Just how do you start with a thesis? Do you start with a question you're trying to answer? How do you research? How do you organize what you find? How do you structure the thing? Just all the way from there to the time that you're handing that manuscript to an editor, or when they're working, maybe. I know editors often come in the process before a finished manuscript, but what's your process like from start to finish to get a book done?
Well, I don't know if I'm the right person to teach anyone on this. I mean, I did study, like anyone who went to college, how to make a good essay and using outlines and that sort of thing. I have to say, I kind of stopped using outlines for the various pieces I write because I feel like I kind of know in my head where they're going. I do think that, and this is speaking kind of at a more fundamental level, I'll only write a book or a piece of a book when there's something that I feel I really have to say, and I can't stop myself from putting it down on paper. Like the reason that Walkable City Rules came along, in fact, my more recent book, was because I was just, oh my God, people are still getting this stuff wrong. And it's so easy. And the answers are so clear. And why don't more people know this? And this burning desire to communicate something. If you have that, then all the rest is of statistically insignificant importance. If you have something you really want to say and arguments you really want to make, or arguments you've been making but just haven't put down on paper, that's the best kind of book, right? And no one sets out to say, I want to write a book. They set out to say, I want people to know this thing. And that's how the book happens.
Yeah, that's definitely my experience. I've had more than a few guests who said, I never meant to write a book, but I shared something.
Well, no, at a certain point, you make the decision, particularly if you're trying to get a contract. And by the way, I don't know if the world needs more books. I think the world needs the right books. And nowadays, people are reading less. And there are so many books out there. And essentially anyone who wants to create a book can, in one form or the other. I do give the advice, and it's a little bit kind of mercenary, but I ask people who tell me, because I get emails like this fairly frequently. They say, I want to write a book about this or that. And I say, okay, what's going to cause this book to be read, right? What about this book, actually about what's in it, but about what form it takes is going to cause people to read it. And so a lot of that is about finding and selling the right publisher who has a marketing wing. And finding the right publisher usually means finding an agent. And, I didn't know this when I started, but if you want to have a book that is widely read, then it probably needs to come from a limited number of publishing houses, and access to those houses is through a limited number of agents. And really the first step is creating a package, an outline, and a sample chapter, and a brief description of what the book's about and all of that, and finding an agent that will take you on. And I think that's if you want your book read, that is that path.
So then the final part of this is, many people, if they do set their sights on writing a book, publishing a book, they often see that as the finish line. And heaven knows that is its own, victory. But I think those people will be disappointed if no one ever reads that book. If no one learns about it, if no one cares about it, nobody buys it, tells their friends, and so forth. So this leads to the question perhaps of marketing, of promotion. What have you learned about marketing and promoting a book that has been useful to you?
Well, I think because I've done it all. And I think that there are certain force multipliers. Is that the term? Force multipliers that are thresholds for new levels of readership. So unlike, people don't do book tours much anymore. They found that book tours aren't particularly effective at selling books unless you're already famous and people show up because they want to see you, right? We have such a dedicated audience or fans, then it really makes sense to do book tours. But as long as 10 years ago, I was told book tours aren't really a thing anymore. But I'm an author who, because of the work that I do in cities, I'm giving lectures all over the place all the time. And those do sell books. But a typical lecture to 200 people might sell 30 books. And if you do that day after day after day in city after city after city, pretty soon you've sold a lot of books. But I would say that, the 100 lectures I've given since I wrote Walkable City have probably sold a fraction of the books that my one TED Talk has sold, right? And the black box that is TED is a extreme mystery. How do you do a TED Talk that becomes the headliner on their webpage, for example? I can't offer any insight there, but I can tell folks that if your goal is to get in, and this is a bit of an answer about, why write a book? Like maybe a book isn't the right vehicle. If your goal is to get certain ideas out into the world, I would say, a great videotape talk can be more effective than a book. But certainly if you've already got a book or you're trying to promote a book, developing in concert your speaking ability and your package that you offer to people who might have you speak, including TED or similar venues, is super important. And being a good speaker and being a good writer are two entirely different things that are, and speaking, a lot of people think that if they have a good thing to say and they're reasonably articulate, that they can just get up and give talks that will be successful. But it's really its own skill set that you have to learn and practice and make an effort at. But for me in particular, the TED Talks were incredible force multipliers, honestly, both for my books and for my practice. A lot of the work that I do is because in my firm is because someone's seen the TED Talks. And of course there's other talks too, but that isn't necessarily helpful to someone who isn't currently doing a lot of public speaking. But honestly, I think it depends what kind of writer you want to be. If you're principally writing because you have an idea that you wish more people shared, then you need to work every cylinder. And one of those is public speaking, and you should take the time to become good at it. Another important lesson I learned from Andres and have experienced on my own is that there's nothing wrong. In fact, there's something very right with giving the same talk over and over and over and over and over and over again. And Andres gave his Towns versus Sprawl talk probably 500 times over 10 years. And every time he made it sound fresh, and he made it sound like these ideas had kind of just come to him. And it's disingenuous, right? You're not being honest with your audience. You're probably not being honest with your audience if you're telling them something that you've done, that you've told 100 different audiences over the last X number of years, excitedly, like you've just discovered it. But that's the way to give a good talk.
Yeah. Well, that's really in some ways probably no different from a musician performing the same song.
It's like
year after year.
Hear Freebird, but there's a difference, which is that everyone knows that a musician is a performer. But if you're a professional or an intellectual or someone who's trying to share ideas, you are turned off by the idea of thinking that you're a performer and not just a thinker or a professional. So you have to get over that hump. And honestly, I don't do it enough. But my talks have slowly evolved over 20 years. And they frankly haven't changed all that much. And in any given year, they change very little. And the reason is, and it's easy to forget this, that every new audience hasn't heard it before, right? And you should treat each new audience like it was your first talk, because for them it is. And that's hard because it's not honest. And it's not necessarily gratifying to consider yourself a performer. But if you do that, you'll do a much better job and you'll be more effective in spreading your message.
You know what this makes me think about is two things. One is, I forget the preacher's name, Russell Conway. I just Googled it, who delivered this talk, Acres of Diamonds.
Yeah, I don't know.
In the religious, this was like back in the 1800s. But I think I read once about this guy. I believe he delivered this talk literally 5,000 times. And then it became, a pamphlet and the word spread and all this. So, there are people that take that out to an extreme for sure. But the other one that's also kind of in this philosophical religious vein is the philosopher Alan Watts. I read his autobiography and he talked about how he saw himself as a spiritual entertainer. Like he embraced the persona, the beard, the robe, and so forth. So there's something to be said. But what you said about if you have a burning desire to say something, to communicate something, a book might just be one form. Speaking is another form. Videos are another form. But I think there's something really valuable about that, because in some of the work I do where people, they want to write. I think in many cases, they don't even necessarily know why they want to write, They want to be a writer. What you're saying is awesome. That's right. They want to be a writer, or they want to have written a book, that kind of thing. So I think this is all for anybody who wants to write. I hope this is really useful insight that you're providing from the real world experience of decades doing this.
So why are you so interested? Are you doing a book? Have you done a book?
I am. I've written one book about my dad. It was really a collection of stories. And I've written another book. I haven't published it yet. I'm offering it now as an online course. And then I'm just fascinated by language. I'm fascinated by creativity, by writing, human interaction, so it's something that, to be honest, I've said for a long time, I don't know what else to do with my life, but ask questions like this and share what I find. But I believe it's more empowering to say, I don't think there's anything I'd rather do than have these kinds of inquiries. In fact, I divided my reading list not long ago into authors living and dead. And it's like, oh, I want to talk to these people while they're still alive, So
glad I made the cut.
Me too. Yeah. So this has been a ton of fun for me. I hope it has for you. I'm grateful that you're doing the work you are. I'm definitely going to research some of what we talked about, like cul-de-sac. I am interested in your course at Harvard. Maybe I'll join you for that when it resumes.
You seem like someone who has a lot of different interests, which we all should have. So I don't know to what degree the creation of physical community is a priority for you. But I would be remiss in my duties as a planner to not make it very clear that I am offering to work with you to create a car-free community somewhere in America. And we could do something spectacular.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm not even sure what to do with that, but that's something I'd like to talk with you about more when privately. It's very interesting.
It becomes a priority to you. If the creation of physical community is on your bucket list, right? Because some people care about that, other people don't. But if it's on your bucket list, then let's pursue it. And you're welcome to take some time to consider it before we reconvene.
Yeah, to this point, it hasn't been, but I'm interested. I mean, I've put my toe in the water a little bit here in Salt Lake City with things like restorative justice and how can we live, more harmoniously and more equitably. So it's very intriguing, and I definitely want to keep learning from you and staying connected with you. So that's awesome.
Well, thank you for what you do and for the attention. It's nice to be wanted.
No, it's my pleasure. So final advice, encouragement, anything, whether it's related to writing, creativity, promotion, new urbanism, anything, design, anything that you would leave people listening with as kind of an uplifting conclusion to this.
Well, the uplifting changes what I was about to say.
That's fine. Let's start with what you were going to say.
Well, no, I think that about once a month, I get a tweet or an email from someone who says, I read Walkable City or Suburban Nation, and now I can't stand where I live. Thank you for making me miserable. Wow. And I think a lot of people are trapped in their environment for a number of reasons. And our goal as designers and folks who do what I do, and by the way, we collect under an organization called the Congress for New Urbanism. If you're interested in this stuff, cnu.org is our corner pub. I mean, it's where we all go and we convene and we share ideas. And the Congress has a charter that's called the Charter of New Urbanism. But the degree to which people feel trapped. Oh, what I was going to say is through this work that we all do together, our mission is to create more places that are more livable and to make them more attainable to more people, right? But understanding that you may not have a choice. I think a lot of people don't understand or don't fully appreciate that they have more choice. They may have more choice than they think, and that the sacrifices they may have to make to live in a more walkable environment are not as great as they think they are, and are certainly outweighed by positives that they have not yet considered. And that not anyone, but for many of us who long for a more connected, a more communal, a more healthy, physically, mentally, socially environment, have the opportunity to rethink our suburban lifestyles and reorganize them with less dependency on the automobile in ways that are more achievable than they may at first seem.
Okay, awesome. That might be tough to put in a tweet, but this could be one of those. It's like 1 of 6, 2, 6, and so forth. No, that's great. That's a great thought. If people want to learn more from you or they want to connect with you, what would you have them do?
I have created this website with help that is intended to be a really good portal into all the stuff that I'm doing. You mentioned blogs. I've never blogged, but I do write articles in addition to books, and access to all of that, to a whole bunch of videos, to a whole bunch of projects and everything else.
And a course at Harvard.
Yeah, I'll mention that as well. Maybe you could join me in a year or two whenever that restarts. But the website is jeffspeck.com, JEFFSPECK. And there's even a button there that you just push it and you can send me an email. So I answer every email I get, even if just to say I don't have time to talk to you, I will answer. And so that is really the one-stop shop. I think that, I would love for folks to take my 2-day class that's offered almost every summer at the Harvard School of Design on making more walkable cities. However, I would say that, the real first step for people who like to read would be the book Walkable City. The first step for people who don't want to take on another book right now would be the 2 TEDtalks, starting with the one called The Walkable City. And from there, the website charts out a very clear course of angles for learning more.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing so generously of your time and your experience with me and everybody listening. I have gone on the microlending site kiva.org, and I've made a $100 microloan to a woman entrepreneur named Martha, who's in Nicaragua, who will use this money to buy materials to further her business as a seamstress, to improve the quality of life for people in her community, herself, and her family. So thanks for giving me a reason to go make that microloan.
Thank you for doing that. I always do round up my annual charity on the last day of the year, and I gave to about a dozen different organizations and tweeted it out to everyone who would listen to hopefully get more people to. And yes, by the way, I am on Twitter, even though I'm trying to be on it less, and I do use it a lot. So you could also follow me on Twitter, and that is Jeff Speck, FAICP after my name. But there are so many great organizations in almost every community, if not around walking, around biking. And then, of course, most major cities have a regional growth organization like the Coalition for Smarter Growth in Washington, D.C., or some other group that's fighting sprawl. And those can be really great resources to support as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, Jeff, thanks again for making time. As I said, I've enjoyed this. I've learned a ton from you already, and I'm looking forward to learning even more and staying connected in the future.
Thank you, Brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Take care. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life isn't working for many people. Whether it's in the developed world, where we're dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, divorce, jobs we hate, relationships that don't work, or people in the developing world who don't have access to clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or who live in conflict zones. There's a lot of people on the planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, I invite you to connect with me at goodliving.com. I've created Life's Best Practices Breakthrough Coaching to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated school, you're going through a divorce, you just got married, you're headed into retirement, you're starting a business, you just lost your job, whatever it is you're facing, I've developed a 36-week course that you go through with me and a community of achievers and seekers who are committed to improving their own lives and the lives of others. So through this online program, you will have the opportunity to go deep into every area of your life, explore life's big questions, create answers for yourself in community, get clarity and accountability. If that's something you're interested to learn about, I invite you to contact me directly at brian@brianmiller.com or by visiting goodliving.com.